the plane. The only conservative voices brave enough to push back. This is the Conservative Daily Podcast with Joe Otto.
That's what the Second Amendment was designed to do. If you're going to do something to nullify or take away my rights under the Constitution, come get it.
Max McGuire.
When you look at politicians on the left, they need to convince people that they are victims.
Conservative voice resistance to the resistance. And now your hosts, Joe Otto and Max McGuire.
And welcome back to another edition of the Conservative Daily Podcast. We are going live on vMix for the first time. That is going to be cool. Joe Otto is still on his little sabbatical. So Keith Jones is going to be filling in for him again today. Keith, how's it going?
Yeah, it's going great, Max. How are you?
Pretty good. Just trying to edit the description on the Facebook page. Still trying to work out all of the kinks today. But today I want to talk to you, Keith, about Donald Trump's latest statement, what he's been talking about. In case everyone doesn't know, yesterday Twitter decided to, how do you want to describe this? They decided to fact check him in real time. Talk a little bit about that, Keith, as I edit this.
Yeah, so he put a post up and he was talking about mail-in voting, right? And it's the cause du jour right now for Democrats in the House. Mail-in voting, because, the My Sharona Schmirish. And so Trump responded that this is a surefire way. This is me paraphrasing, a surefire way for voter fraud. And then he was fact-checked by the preeminent fact checkers at Twitter that this was a demonstrably false claim, that there has not been instances of fraud in mail-in voting in the past, which is actually demonstrably false, because shortly thereafter, the beautiful fact check claiming that it was false, there's actually a story of somebody being convicted for mail-in voter fraud.
Yeah, so he wasn't convicted yet, but immediately after Donald Trump said that if you go nationwide with mail-in voting, there's going to be fraud. Almost immediately after, same day, yesterday, a West Virginia mail carrier was indicted, was charged with attempted absentee ballot application fraud. So what does that mean? That means that in order to get your absentee ballot, you need to apply for it, right? So there's two elements of this. There's the first element, which is obviously the ballot reaches you. That's mail-in voting. But there's also the application part where someone applies to receive the ballot beforehand. They fill out the form and they tell you where to send that ballot. So if there's fraud at that level, then the whole thing's kaput, right? If people can get in and change where ballots should go, submit fraudulent mail-in ballot applications, then Trump's absolutely right, because that's what he's worried about. He's worried the system we have now is set up so that people who are sick and people who are going to be absent on election day can vote by mail because they can't be there in person. And if they can't show up to an early voting center in person, it was never designed for everyone to vote by mail. So obviously there's going to be fraud. And I just think it's so funny that immediately after Twitter decides to fact check him, we get this news that there was actually a postal carrier who was indicted over this. It's an incredible timing, because you look at the tweet that Trump put out. Twitter decided, and we're going to talk about the ramifications for Twitter. They decided to fact check him and go to places like CNN, point to places like CNN, claiming that Trump was lying. Now, Trump is in a war with CNN, has been in a war since the day he was sworn in, right? Everything he says, they claim he's lying, right? To see Twitter use CNN as an authoritative source is absolutely incredible, because CNN no longer has that line delineating between the actual news and the editorial sections. The news department itself has been editorialized. there is no separation between them anymore. The whole thing is one big op-ed. So to see Twitter citing CNN as an authoritative fact-checking source is incredible, because as we want to talk about today, that has serious ramifications for Twitter, serious ramifications for other social media platforms that have rolled out similar measures, because that calls into question whether they have protections under what's called Section 230 of, I believe it's the Communications Decency Act. Section 230, what that says is basically protects online websites, and basically says there's two kinds of online websites. There's the platforms that allow third-party users to post their own comments, their own messages, and then there's publishers, which editorialize and decide what goes on and what doesn't go on. Websites like Twitter, Facebook, they are protected as platforms. Now, what does that mean? That means that if you go on, Keith, and you were to post a bomb threat, and you put it on Facebook, you put it on Twitter, those social media sites would not be liable for that. I mean, if they kept it up and they knew it was there, they would be. But simply because it appeared on their site, they wouldn't be liable because they didn't editorialize that. They didn't approve that. You just posted it, right? If Facebook and Twitter was to run something through their, I don't know, their marketing department and put out a press release announcing a bomb threat, right? That would be a publisher because they've actually curated that content and decided, yes, we're going to put it up. So Facebook and Twitter only exist because they have that protection. They have that protection from liability, that if people go on and they post crazy things, illegal things, threatening things, Facebook and Twitter and all those social pages aren't legally accountable. But talk to me about this, because yesterday with Twitter fact-checking the president and actually editorializing, they've really created a blurry line between whether they're a platform or a publisher. Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So going back, so let's do some way back history, right? When the internet first came out, before that, right, we were talking about breaking up the big telecom industries, right? So this is the beginning of this idea that you could not be, you can't be, your service for communications cannot be turned off. Your access can't be turned off because you say something that the carrier doesn't like, right? Fast forward, and you have the introduction of the internet, and then there was a lawsuit, I believe. There's probably been a couple of them, but there were conversations in the 90s, specifically around Prodigy, because they made a statement that talked about how they were going to moderate content. So then this came to light, with pornography and some other things. We're trying to sort of realize what was possible on the internet back before, people knew what was possible. So they had this conversation, and then they were sued, right? And it went through the courts, right? And then that was the predicating act, because they were labeled as a publisher, right? Because they said openly that they were going to moderate content. That preceded the passage of, right, Section 230, which you're talking about. And so what I find really interesting is, again, this is really gray and it's written in lawyerly language, right? And then you can view that how you would like to view it, which is basically being viewed by Twitter and Google and Facebook and others, YouTube, right? That it's always favorable to them. But the hypocrisy that's on display, right? We seem to fall on this theme a lot, is very brazen, because, right, these are the same people who are arguing, right, net neutrality.
Yeah.
The free and open internet.
Free and open internet.
But, and Mark Zuckerberg, there's actually a post on Facebook from him. He didn't take it down. It's still there. He's arguing in 2017 for free and open internet, right? And he literally says in his posts, right, broadband providers, were this law to be repealed, could effectively turn off or block sources that go around, quote unquote, their guidelines. And here we go, fast forwarding. He now has his own guidelines. So he's arguing out of one point of his mouth, one side of his mouth, right? That you shouldn't have, you should have free and open access to the internet, and information should be able to be shared. And how dare, Verizon turn off access, right? Or Comcast turn off access to my ability to have access to the internet because they have some sort of guidelines that talk about their ability to accept content that falls afoul of that. And then he turns around 5 seconds later and says, actually, I can deplatform you. And this is the problem. Carriers cannot stop my access to the phone because I say things over the phone that they don't like, that they don't agree with.
Unless you were talking about like you were a terrorist in a terrorist situation,
sure.
Like they could cut your phone line if they had a police order, but they can't listen into your conversations and decide that they don't like what you're talking about. You shouldn't be allowed to have a phone number.
But can Facebook, YouTube, Google, Twitter remove you from their quote unquote platform for saying things that they deem out of bounds or incorrect or that fall afoul of their political bend? And the answer is yes, they can.
They can.
So are they a platform? Are they advocating for the free and open internet? Or are they a quote unquote publisher because they are clearly moderating their content?
Yeah, it's interesting. You bring up the net neutrality piece, and that was a big part of what they were saying. They were worried that if net neutrality didn't pass, they actually made a financial argument to it. They tried to play to the public's heartstrings. They basically made the claim that if you had Comcast, here's an example, if you have Comcast as your internet provider, Comcast has a financial stake in their video on demand platform. They want their subscribers to watch online videos on Comcast's on-demand platform. They don't want you going over to Netflix because not only is Netflix a direct competitor, but Netflix is one of the biggest, I think it's actually the biggest hog of internet bandwidth worldwide. As a single website, Netflix takes up more internet bandwidth, I'm pretty sure, than any other company. And interestingly enough, when everyone started working from home, when the lockdown started, Netflix actually voluntarily agreed to reduce how high quality their videos were so they would take less bandwidth because everyone was all of a sudden watching Netflix at all hours of the day. So they made this claim that you needed to support net neutrality because like if you didn't, you'd have tech companies that would basically stop you from accessing Hulu or Netflix because they'd rather you access their content, and that they might enact these virtual tolls that would charge you to be able to access their competitor site. That's what we were told, right? Net neutrality, obviously, that never came to pass, but net neutrality did go into effect, at least in some terms. And they were afraid that the government was going to come in. The government was going to regulate what you talked. Basically, the businesses made the argument that you needed net neutrality to protect yourself. Now, fast forward all this time, and we're talking not about Facebook blocking your access to their competitors. We're talking about Facebook blocking what you're allowed to say, Twitter blocking what you're allowed to say, YouTube blocking what you're allowed to say. There was a story that just broke yesterday that YouTube's algorithm has been flagging Chinese comments and automatically deleting them because they were critical of the Chinese Communist Party. I don't speak Chinese, but they translate to Communist Bandit and 50-Cent Party, which apparently is very insulting to the Chinese Communist Party. YouTube's algorithm was automatically deleting those anytime someone posted it. So I just think it's so interesting with the net neutrality argument. We had this argument that, if you don't, we don't want government to control everything that you're doing. Now we're in a world where these tech companies are taking the side of Communist China as an example. They're literally adopting Chinese Communist Party talking points. It's incredible. We've basically traded one devil for another.
Right. Again, they're arguing for the libel protections because they're a platform while simultaneously operating like an editorial board. Yeah. Because you're right. You can, as just a fun thought experiment, I'm sure that people in our audience watch videos on YouTube, right? Go on YouTube and watch your favorite channels, particularly if they talk about politics and they're not, find people that aren't part of, major broadcasting networks. Find the smaller podcasts and find the guys who have 100,000 subscribers to even up to Steven Crowder and 4.5 million people that follow him. Right? They've been demonetized. So Steven Crowder's been demonetized. Right? The Daily Wire depends on what Ben Shapiro talks about. Right? He's been demonetized depending on what he's talking about. But find the smaller ones. They will literally record podcasts and YouTube videos where they will overtly say, I was about to say a word that I'm not allowed to say, because if I do say it, then YouTube will not allow monetization of it. So they're being watched. They know they're being watched. And that has an effect. And they're being self-deprecating when they do it. They're acknowledging that it's there, and they still, right, their livelihoods and part of their livelihoods are tied to these channels, and they're openly admitting that the guidelines that they have to follow stop them from saying things that they want to say that are clearly in bounds of them saying. Yeah. Think about, there was an instance, right? Think about Rand Paul saying the name that shall not be said, right, in polite public during his speech on the Senate floor during the impeachment hearing.
Yeah.
You can't find that video because it has words in it that shall not be said, deemed to be not said by our betters, right? I thought there was an amazing thing that Ted Cruz did, and I think it was sometime early last year, where somebody put a video up, a podcaster put a video up, and it was taken down. YouTube took it down. So Ted Cruz just picked up the video and put it on his channel, and the only thing he said was, take this down, right? ... Go ahead and try and take this down. And I remember joking with you, like, now we have a sitting U.S. Senator that's basically saying, go ahead and apply your non-free speech rules to me because I'm a sitting senator. And they left the video up.
Yeah, well, of course, because it's stunning that they've gotten to the point where they're now fact-checking the president in real time. I mean, we can talk about the actual employees at Twitter who are fact-checking it. They're rabid leftists. Absolutely far left. They're unapologetically far left. What's stunning, though, is that they want to straddle the fence. They really want to have their cake and eat it, too. They want to be regulated as a platform, but have the ability to be a publisher. Now, a lot of times what you hear is, the First Amendment doesn't apply because they are a private corporation, right? They're publicly traded, but they're a private corporation. They're not a government entity, which is right. But we do have, as you mentioned, libel laws. We do have slander laws that are still in effect. So when you have, it's hard to prove. It is hard to prove, but there's lots of liabilities for publishers. If they get things wrong, they can be sued. You look at the kid at that protest in Washington, D.C., where they slandered him. They claimed that he was attacking a Native American man beating a drum, and it ended up being the complete opposite. They knew it, but they published fake news anyway. There's liabilities to being a publisher. When you choose what goes out over the airwaves, when you choose what goes out on your website, there's liabilities. If you get it wrong, if you defame someone, if you slander someone, if you libel someone, there are serious consequences. So they want to be the platform that's basically unregulated. They have to take down things that are illegal. They have in their terms of service that they take down mean things. I don't even think technically that would apply. But they also want to be the publisher. So when you see Trump say that big action is coming, and then you see all these talking heads saying Trump can't do anything, the First Amendment doesn't apply, they're missing the point. The point is that if Facebook, Twitter, YouTube were all of a sudden to lose the liability protections afforded to them under Section 230, it would be catastrophic for them. If all of a sudden they were held responsible for everything that gets posted because they've already admitted that they're curating content, it would be catastrophic to their business model. They'd be sued into bankruptcy, sued into oblivion, right? And that's what Trump is talking about. So when you hear them say, oh, no, he can't do anything, the First Amendment doesn't apply to that, they're right, but it's lying by omission because that's not what Trump is talking about. He's not Trump talking about kicking down Twitter's door and arresting people because they violated the First Amendment. No, they're talking about heavier regulation because Twitter has now become a publisher. Twitter has now decided that when you post something, they're going to add their own editorializing underneath it. So I hate when we're seeing in the media, we're seeing them say, oh, Trump can't do anything, or even accusing Trump of violating the First Amendment by going after them. It's really disingenuous because these people know better, but they're deliberately withholding this crucial piece of evidence about Section 230, maybe because they don't want to get into it, but also because it's much more enjoyable for them to paint the president as some tyrant.
Right. I mean, it's bound to come to a head, right? Because we're talking about the essence of the law, the regulation, right, is to help make sure and maintain that obscene, right, lewd, violent content isn't put out there, right? It was never meant to be covering political opinions you didn't like, right? The same rules that apply to any station that uses public airways, right? That's what we're talking about. And you're right in terms of you don't even to make a case, you don't even have to write your own intent, right? You can just use their own words. They say exactly what you just said, right? Because they want the protections of the libel laws. We're a platform. There's an infinite amount, not infinite. There's a lot of examples of Mark Zuckerberg saying that we are a platform. He's been excoriated by the left in the last few months because he came out with his policy late last year that said, it's not my job to take down what you consider false ads. Yeah. It's not my job. He said that in Congress and people went crazy, right? And now the same people are rooting him on because now he's got his, quote unquote, Supreme Court of content moderation, right? And they always seem to bend one way. But remember, when you're using public airways and you espouse an opinion, you are required, is a strong word, but I'm just going to use it. You're required to provide an opposite opinion. This is why you see talk shows that have the token conservative or the token liberal right on the show. It's because they have to.
Well,
right?
the fairness doctrine, the fairness doctrine isn't nearly as strong. Most of it has already been abolished at this point.
Right, but the
things that are left,
principles, right? They build on themselves.
Yeah, the things that are left over from that is when it comes to like advertising. If you have one candidate on, you have to have the other candidate on. But there's no longer any requirement for like cable news talk shows to show both sides. That's not even a requirement.
Cable news. Right.
They still do that in fairness. I mean, some channels more than others. But the fairness doctrine that used to require that is gone. It's completely gone. The only thing that remains, as I mentioned, comes with like paid political advertising. As a channel, you can't say I'm going to take Democrat ads, but I'm not going to let a Republican show an ad.
Right, but now, okay, so what you're hitting on is exactly where I was going, right? So you just led me right into the next point because, right, Twitter made the announcement we were no longer going to allow political advertising for the 2020 election, right?
Yes.
So Dorsey came out and said that, and everybody cheered. Thank goodness, right? No. The actual opposite is actually occurring. Okay, so they came out with a new feature on Twitter that will make it so that if you say something on Twitter, you can disallow sharing and comments.
Yeah.
So now things can be said, and they are being said by certain news organizations that, have the letters CNN in them, right? Where you can't actually combat or rebut or even comment on what they're saying. It just gets held as truth, right?
Yeah.
So who has one of the largest voices on Twitter? Well, it's the President of the United States, right? So how can we, without being overt about it, although I think, it's pretty clear to people who are looking that it's pretty overt, how can we minimize his voice? Because if you don't allow political ads, right, but you allow influencers who are all generally leaning one way, because I can remove the influencers who go the other way, I have effectively created an advertising platform that you can't rebut.
Yeah.
You put an ad in a place, right? You can't rebut the ad. You can talk about the ad, but you can't rebut the ad directly, right? So which means that people who see it aren't going to see your response unless they find you, right? So as we're unmasking what they're actually doing, they are actually playing a game where advertising still exists for me, but not for thee.
Yeah.
And this is just the next step in, we'll use fact checking, quote unquote, fact checking, right? Truth over facts, to make sure that we're minimizing. And now you have people openly calling for the Twitter account of the President of the United States to be removed because they don't like what he says. I don't care if you don't like what he says, right?
Well, CNN does
for
that.
First Amendment protection.
CNN, I'll never forget, there was on CNN, I think it was a couple years ago, where there was a Trump supporter who was posting something online, and she was like engaging with Russian pages or something like that. Twitter actually found her, put her name on the air, and doxed her. She started getting threats. They do this all the time. Their goal is to deplatform people. They actually, and that's what's just so infuriating. Like, their argument is, if you're just an individual, you get kicked off of Facebook, get kicked off of YouTube, kicked off of Twitter. It's horrible. It shouldn't happen. But if you have built a business around this, if this is your livelihood, if you've invested to grow a Facebook page, you've invested in Twitter ads to grow a following, right? You've actually paid them money to grow your following. And all of a sudden they just turn it off. That happened to our Facebook page a year ago. They throttled our organic reach. So in order to reach more people, and I'll shamelessly plug this, if you like this show and you want more people to see it, please do hit that share button. Because Facebook, as an example, we reach less people than we would have if we were a non-political page. Because Facebook has decided that even though we've invested to serve advertisements, encourage people to follow our page, encourage people to like our page, under the assumption that would boost our organic reach. Actually, not even the assumption. That's what Facebook told us. You get more followers, you'll reach more people. All of a sudden, they've changed the rules of the game. So we've invested in something, and now they've selectively decided that we don't qualify anymore. So it's one thing if you're a person, but they're going after businesses. They're going after politicians. They're influencing an election, whether you like it or not. I'm far more worried about tech companies than I ever was about Russian troll farms.
Yeah. It's real simple, Max. If these are neutral platforms, then they get immunity from litigation, right? Bar none. If they're neutral platforms, they get immunity from litigation. But if they're publishers because they're making editorial choices, right? Then Section 230 immunity, right? It doesn't apply, because basically you're to protect free speech, right? Is the exact opposite of free, quote unquote, free speech, where you're in control of the message and you can censor what is actually being seen, right? Those two things are in conflict. Go look up. You can actually go find this right after the podcast. Don't do it now, but do it later, right? The CEO of YouTube, she's on a conference call with her own employees, her own developers, and they're talking about the feedback. If you've gone to YouTube recently, they have like this authoritative news section that's all, the mainstream news outlets talking one way about, the My Sharona Schmeiris, right? That's all it is. And then there's just,
scamdemic, the shamdemic.
Yes, the shamdemic, right? And so they were talking to her and they said, our users hate this. I can't tell you the number of times I've clicked on it. Do not show me this. Do not show me. And it always reappears, right? And her response was, we have a duty to share authoritative content.
Yeah.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
I thought your algorithm was tailored around content that I would want to engage with.
Yeah.
And that like-minded content that has a similarity or a bend to things that I might be interested in gets shown to me, because that would increase my use of your quote-unquote platform. But now it's from the CEO. We have a duty to share authoritative content.
And I think that's the problem in all of this. Usually when we think of editorializing, we think of there's an editorial staff, they write an op-ed, it gets pushed up the line to the editor, editorial staff, they make edits, and then they publish it under the brand of the website. That's what we usually think of editorializing. But with big tech, it's shifted. These companies aren't the ones writing the content, but they are picking the winners and the losers. They are picking who sees what and what gets shown. So personally, I don't see any difference between Facebook itself writing an op-ed saying that I don't see any difference. Look at Twitter. I don't see any difference between Twitter saying Trump is wrong, here's why, and Twitter all of a sudden feeding CNN to viewers with the same idea, right? They're still curating content. They're still publishing what they want people to see. So
correct.
Are they platforms anymore? I would argue no. And so when you see Trump talking about big action is coming, and then you hear all the disinformation noise, what he's talking about, likely, unless there's something else I don't even know about, what he's talking about is likely the fact that their platform status could be challenged, in which case it would go to the DOJ. If the DOJ would have tremendous authorities to pursue some kind of legal action against publishers pretending to be platforms, right? There's a lot of wiggle room there. There's also a lot of wiggle room in a declaration then encouraging third parties to file their own lawsuits. Because as I said, as soon as you are a publisher, you are legally responsible for what you allow to be posted. But again, they want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to be able to curate the content. I mean, we talked about this on the show, me and Joe. Go ahead and try on Facebook to share a link to joebiden.info. Try to post it onto your Facebook page. it won't happen. Facebook has determined that hyperlink, which is not fake news, it's just someone who bought joebiden.info and filled it with a bunch of clips of Joe Biden saying really stupid stuff. Facebook has decided that is malicious, it's dangerous, and that no one on its platform should be allowed to see or share that. That is what we talk about when we say Facebook is a publisher pretending to be a platform. They claim that you can go on, and as long as you don't do anything illegal or really, really horrible, it gets posted. But then they're blocking joebiden.info for no reason other than the fact that they don't want people to see Joe Biden's gaffes, right? So that's what we're talking about when we're saying that these tech companies are publishers. They've been publishers for a long time.
Right. I think the point you just made deserves to be reiterated, because what's happening is we're talking about Facebook, Google, Twitter, YouTube, right, et al. We're talking about them as if they're separate entities. But the analogy that you just made, if you think of quote unquote Facebook, I don't care that there's thousands of employees. If you think of Facebook as an entity, it is effectively the chief editor. Yeah. So it gets to decide what stories, what reporters. Now it gets muddied because, well, we're sharing CNN content and we're sharing content from MSNBC and we're sharing content from Fox, right? But no, you're not. Because it's the secondary stories, it's the follow-on stories, right? Yeah. Where the editorial board of the New York Times has control over what gets published in the New York Times, right? They do. And the chief editor has absolute control. It's in their charge. It's in that person's charge. If you think about Facebook not as an organization, but as the chief editor, what they're actually doing is exactly what you just said. They're choosing which reporters to hire. I don't care whether you call that a reporter or whether you call that a news station or whether you call that an opinion section of CNN. They're choosing that, and then they're not hiring the other reporter who is talking about other stories, other facts, right? There is, when you think about that story that you just told, that analogy that you just told, it's important that people understand, because if you look at them as separate entities, right, you can pick apart the argument and still call them platforms. But if you understand that they are in charge of what does and doesn't get selected as postable content, shareable content, right, then they are no longer a separate entity. They're the chief editor. Yeah. They're in charge, right? And that's what we're talking about. It's redefining. They have redefined themselves, right? Facebook of 2008 is not Facebook of 2020. Google of 2006, 7, 8 is not Google in 2020, right? Yeah. And that's the same down the line for all of these platforms, right? All of these sites. I use the word platform. Man, I wish they were platforms. I just don't believe that they are, because they are now making choices about who can share. These are their hired reporters, and then they can use that hey, anybody can post information, but no, they cannot. Yeah. Right? Because you are no longer allowed to do follow-up stories, right, about content that they have deemed, quote unquote, fake, or that they've fact-checked as not true. Yeah. Right? You're just not allowed to have dissenting opinion anymore. That makes you a publisher. They're a publisher.
Yeah. If you put something on the internet and another website that Facebook has deemed to be more authoritative disagrees, even a little bit, Facebook changes the way that content will appear to its users. If you post a video that some other website that Facebook likes better has decided is partially false, even just partially false, right? If you get one tiny thing wrong, we had this happen to us on our Conservative Daily Facebook page, facebook.com/Conservative Daily, all one word. We had this happen where we posted a video. It was raw video of Joe Biden talking. And because a fact checker watched this video and interpreted what he said slightly different, right? They wrote their transcript and they changed one word. They heard it differently, right? Facebook declared that it was fake news, that it was partially false. So we published the video, but when other people looked at it, instead of seeing our video, they saw a message from Facebook informing them that independent fact checkers have determined that this video is partially false. Learn why, and then a button for those users to choose to continue watching it if they still want to. That is not the action of a platform. That is the action of a publisher. Like the argument that they're a platform is that you're able to post what you want and we don't change it. That's them changing it. They're changing the way that people interact with it. They're changing the way that people see it. I mean, imagine if you put an ad, a classified listing in the newspaper, right? You paid for this classified listing. You want people to see it. And the newspaper changes the phone number, right? That's kind of what we're talking about here. Like we paid for a service. We paid to build our Facebook page. We put out a video, and Facebook is now doing the equivalent of changing the phone number on us to render all of the investment that we've made void, because they've determined that they disagree. Well, that's great. If you have editorial staff, newspapers are free to disagree, but platforms are not. And
Correct.
That's the big difference.
Again, your analogy, man, you are spot on with your analogies today, because think about that classified ad. When you submit your classified ad to a newspaper, for those of us that are old enough to have ever done right?
Crazy, right?
Right? You do that. There is staff at the newspaper that makes sure that that's a valid request, that you're not driving people to some sort of illegal or illicit activity, because they know that should they post that classified ad and people were to find it, they're liable, right, for publishing it.
Yeah.
So how can you, so you're just using the same thing you just said, right? They're making these people that work, these entities, they're making editorial changes. They're making choices. I remember the video that you posted. You posted it without comment. There was no comment in what you did. It was just him talking at a fast food restaurant, skateboarding Robert, right? And Joe Biden talking about what he was going to put him in charge of. And you know why that video was deemed as not accurate? Because people generally don't have a positive response to politicians who say things like, hell yes, we're coming after your AR-15s.
Yeah.
Those are words that came out of his mouth, right? So you can fact check that all you want. He said it, right? So there was no statement, right? But they're sitting at a dining table, right, in a fast food restaurant, and Joe Biden says, this guy, I'm going to put this guy in charge, right? You know exactly who he was pandering to with that video, and everybody knows it. But Facebook's not going to allow you to Facebook's not going to allow people to see that, because everyone remembers that quote. Because as soon as he made that quote, it was over. It was over for him before that, but it was over.
Remember when Hillary Clinton took her header at the 9/11 memorial and she got tossed into her medical van like a side of beef?
Yes.
That was, as these social media companies did what they called the post-mortem. I mean, if you want to see what they actually think of the American people, they said they needed a post-mortem after the 2016 election. They viewed that incident of Hillary Clinton falling and having to be tossed into a van. She actually lost her shoe. That's how bad that was, right? She went down so hard, she lost a shoe in the process. I'll tell you, Keith, I've been to the 9/11 memorial. I cannot fathom walking in with two shoes and only leaving with one. Can't fathom it, right? I guess a kid, I mean, that always really confused me. Like, a brief aside, like going through like elementary school, middle school, you look at the lost and found, and people are just missing their shoes. Like, how did someone come to school with shoes and they leave without shoes? I'm sure I'll experience that as my son grows up. But I can't fathom the idea of going to the 9/11 memorial and leaving with any less than the number of shoes I went with. But that's happened to Hillary Clinton. She lost her shoe. The social media companies determined that Russia, the spooky Russian trolls, pushed that so that more people would see her falling and having to get tossed into a van during nice 70-degree weather. The Russians pushed that to create the narrative that Hillary Clinton was not well, that she was sickly, right? And that it should be Facebook's job to identify moments like that and to stop that from spreading. Where the only thing that, obviously some people editorialized it. I talked to people who were like, they're in neurosurgery, neuroscience, and they told me, that the way she went down, it's not normal, right? People were editorializing it, it's fine, but stopping people from seeing the raw video footage, that's what Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, their post-mortem determined, that people shouldn't have been able to see that footage. That Hillary Clinton should have gotten coverage. should have gotten protected by social media giants. She did an oopsie, and even though it was caught on film, people shouldn't be able to share it. That's not a platform. That's a publisher. It's just incredible to me because now we see things like what Joe Biden's doing and joebiden.info. And we see it all happening again. It's not an accident that they've promised to stop Democrat gaffes and Democrat mistakes from being shared and amplified. And all of a sudden they're doing that. So not only does this call into question their Section 230 protections, it also calls into question whether they're even obeying the law in certain states. In California specifically, I know that it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of political affiliation. I'm pretty sure it's the same in Washington, D.C. as well. You cannot discriminate against someone because they're a Republican. Can't do it. It's illegal. You can say you disagree with their political ideas, but you can't say Republicans get less coverage than Democrats. That would be discrimination under I know at least D.C. and California law. So it's not just whether or not these people, these organizations should be regulated as publishers or platforms. This calls into question whether what they're doing is even criminal under state statutes. It's incredible. It's incredible. But they act. I mean, Joe always says they act with impunity because they believe they have immunity. And we're seeing that right here. Google's saying used to be, don't be evil? That used to be Google's slogan, internal slogan. Now they're creating a search engine for the Chinese Communist Party in China that will stop people from sharing things critical of the Chinese Communist Party. Whatever happened to don't be evil? They think that they're untouchable because they've gotten so big. So yes, the reaction's going to have to be treating them like a publisher instead of a platform. Yes, we're going to have to look into whether this amounts to a crime at that point because it's obviously political party discrimination. And beyond that, something we haven't heard from a while, breaking up these companies. Google has gotten huge. I know that's not a very popular conservative opinion, but Google has gotten so huge. You have to start thinking that the antitrust provisions within U.S. law could come into effect and that we might see the government break Google up, break Facebook up, because Facebook is growing too, right? Twitter, not so much, but Facebook and Google have grown exponentially larger than they ever were. They're now in all these different types of spaces. Google more so than the others. It might get to the point where we might actually have to start talking about breaking these companies up because no company should have this much power.
Right. That was the idea behind the breakup of the telecom companies.
Yeah.
Right. In the 80s. And it was the exact same thing because at a certain point in time, you're advocating for two different positions that sit on different sides of a bright red line. And we're watching it right now. I mean, and the way in which these companies are able to couch their language, they have smart lawyers on their side, they have smart PR people on their side. Sometimes it gets out, right? But they're generally able to handle this from a PR standpoint, talking about, things that they believe Americans care about, the protection of your data.
Yeah.
Okay, take that to its logical conclusion. Okay, so Google is going to protect your data. Okay, by the way, Google sells your data on a minute-by-minute basis. Okay, so they know who you are. They know every email you've ever sent. They know every website you've ever visited. They know everything about you, right? So when they say, we're going to protect your data, what they actually mean is we're going to make it more expensive for the same people to access your data today as we're going to who were accessing it yesterday.
Yeah, when they say they're going to protect your data, they're always talking about the third parties. They're never saying we're going to protect your data from us, right? They're still collecting all the data.
Right. They're still collecting all the data, right? They're still in charge of its usage through their own platform. And then when they say things like, we're not going to allow your data to escape, they have thereby consolidated your ability to advertise, right, to themselves. They are the only ones. So they get to decide. Now, right, now go out and see what happens if you put an ad out for your conservative cause or your pro-life cause, right? And look at the cost variations. Look at the reach variations. Look at who's available in your audience and who's not, right? And all these things are connected. They're hard to understand. We talked weeks ago, right? When I guested a couple weeks ago when we were talking about technology, right?
Yeah.
And these are the things, they're hard to understand. These principles are hard to understand.
And they're relying on that.
They're relying on it because it seems sci-fi. I'm telling you, the stuff you see in sci-fi movies is based in reality. That's where it comes from, right? And these things exist. These tracking mechanisms exist. How do you think they're talking about, right, testing and tracing? It's because you get in your phone, right? You carry your phone with you. I can tell you right now, Google knows where you are.
Yeah.
And they could, if they wanted to, they could hand that information to any authority, right? And they could say, this is where this person is. If you don't think that's true, right?
They can voluntarily do it. They can voluntarily do it.
They can voluntarily, and then they can come out and they can say things like, "Oh, we would never do that," right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you have the things that happened, right, with Edward Snowden. Mm-hmm. Somebody just finally says, "No, they're saying one thing and doing the exact opposite."
Yeah.
Right. So these issues are important, right? And our audience, I would encourage our audience, right? You have to be researching this. You have to be reading about it. You have to understand. I always use the analogy of those pictures that came to prominence in the 90s, right? The dots. You stare at the dots and then you can see the sailboat.
Oh yeah.
Right? And then I always have weird things that go through my head about mall rats. But you see the dots, right? And then you see the sailboat come out. You've got to start thinking about these issues that we're talking about in the sense that we got to relax your eyes.
Yeah.
And you can't take verbatim what you're being told. You have to understand what's the underlying technology, what's the underlying possibility, and how are these things being used in a way where I'm being conditioned to think a certain way. I'm being told, right, to think and act a certain way, right? Completely unrelated. The idea of wearing a mask. You've had the heads, right? You've had Fauci say, you've had the CDC say at one point in time it's valuable for you to wear a mask, and other times it doesn't do you any good. If the mask doesn't create a perfect seal, right? And by the way, the cloth mask you're using doesn't. It actually could cause more harm, right?
Yeah.
But if you think about the idea,
do you ever see the video of the woman who walked in wearing underwear over her head?
Yes, right? Yeah, yes. So you're wearing a mask, right? Well, what are they trying to normalize through the ask of getting people to wear masks? You saw videos of people in stores screaming at people and mobbing them out of a store because they weren't wearing a mask. What are they trying to normalize? What are you being told over and over and over that is trying to normalize you to the next step, the next rung, so we can take the next step in sort of what we're trying to accomplish? Because it always seems to go in one direction. It's always moving in one direction, and as an American, as a conservative, right? We have a responsibility to understand what's actually there. This isn't tinfoil stuff we're talking about, right? If you understand how these platforms, how these companies work, right? It's pretty easy to see, even when you're talking to somebody that is talking to you about, the legalese inside of Section 230.
Yeah,
it's still easy to see that the end game, right, is being accomplished one way or the other. And we have to be vigilant and diligent in the way in which we respond, in the way in which we illuminate these issues, because, again, the analogies you were using earlier were great because they paint a really simple picture, the classified ads and the editorial board, right? And it's hard to argue that Facebook, Google, and Twitter and YouTube don't have those things because they flat out tell you that they do.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely true. They really are relying on the fact that this is too complicated for most people to understand. They really are relying on the fact that people don't understand where their data goes. People don't understand. People think it's magic when you walk into a Walmart and all of a sudden you're served a Walmart push notification on your phone. They actually believe that it's just magic. Oh, what a coincidence. What a coincidence that is, right? That I drove past the store and all of a sudden I'm being served an ad to stop and go into that store. They think it's coincidence. They don't understand that yes, it's algorithmic in many senses, but it's also a very people-based too, that people are choosing who will get what. And across the board, that's why I talk about breaking up companies like Google are going to have to be at least a discussion, because Google now knows where most people are. They know what most people are doing. They know what most people are saying. We haven't even talked about the Google Home devices. I have them in my home, and they terrify me in many ways. Yeah. They're listening to what people are saying, right? They're controlling what you're allowed to watch. They're controlling what you're allowed to say. It's too big. No company should
Yep.
have that power. And it's not, I understand it's not a very conservative thing to say, but as I mentioned, Google's motto, internal motto used to be, what is it? Don't be evil. Can you say that that's true anymore? Can you say that Google is living up to that promise that they wouldn't be evil when they had to do a post-mortem over the 2016 election to make sure that they didn't make the mistakes again? And realize they consider their mistakes being that they didn't put their finger on the scale enough. That's what they consider to be their mistake.
Right. I think it's a quintessential conservative value in my mind is, liberty is born through competing ideas. If you're only being told that this thing that again, there's only one choice, there's only one answer. That's the opposite of being conservative. So I understand what you're saying in terms of breaking up, private companies. That's not a conservative thing. But when we're talking about the ability, or hereby the inability, to have conversations based on competing ideas, right? That is a quintessential conservative value. You have to be able to have robust debate about differences and policy differences, right? And understanding of cultural and historical events.
Yeah.
If you strip that away and you say there's only one singular truth, right? Then there is no such thing as our republic any longer, right? It is just it's whoever is in charge gets to say what they want, right? Whenever they want, and you have to eat it, lock, stock, and barrel, right? There's no difference between that and being a part of, right, some sort of communist dictatorship